Okay, we're back for another exciting episode, if you will. Sorry, Mr. Spoon is behind me, and we're ready to go. So, if you are getting this year in 2020, remember that this is going to cover. Some of you asked me. Sorry, I cut it off where I felt appropriate, and it was in the middle of a slide. So, you should have China and the new imperialism is the first thing we're going to be talking about. And then we're going to be looking at, and again, this is largely a review how China emerged as a nationalist power, and then as they were taken over by the imperial powers of Europe. And then we're going to move over here. Again, how did the industrialized countries cause global change? How did imperialism change the way of life in those countries? And by relooking a little bit at Japan, brief look at Mexico after their Declaration of Independence, and a little bit into their revolution, and then a little bit on self-rule in Canada. This was the new slide that we kind of left off halfway through. So again, if you're a freshman, it would be slide 7 in the supplemental becoming slide 30, as you see here. And then if you're the sophomore notebook, it's slide 6 in the supplemental becoming 29. Should have already done that. So let's get cracking here, so that this video doesn't take all too long. Let me get back to it. I have 3 different shows here. Sorry. So China, the open door. Okay. So again, you know how this. Remember how this works. You're going to take notes when you see the outline notes. So again, looking at this, you've got China, open people trying to carve up China, the European powers trying to carve up China, and the Industrial Revolution in England saw people changing the way they live and work, and a new standard of living arose, and saw tea products become very valuable, and the factory owners giving tea made them a little more productive. Tea mixed with sugar. So the Chinese tea factories made this tea and for sale to foreigners, and then it allowed foreigners to open trade centers in one city. The Westerners become addicted, but the Chinese didn't want to trade Western goods. We've heard this story. I'm going through a little bit fast to kind of review the story. The only goods that the Chinese would trade for was silver. So soon Britain's like facing this trade deficit, as I was telling you, as we were talked about much before. So the British need to find a product to sell to the Chinese. They found opium, right? They found opium. And the Chinese were furious and destroyed all the opium they could find, right? They were mad. We talked about the different opium wars. So this led to the opium wars. This gives a little map of the opium wars, just a little bit of review, because it ends up being, on the test, on the overall unit test. So just a quick review of that, the British smuggling in opium and so on. So China, Western powers are using diplomacy to win favorable trade agreements in China. The Qing, the dynasty in charge, is declining. They're faced with a poor economy, widespread corruption because they only have opium and they're not selling anything else. They only have tea and they're not really selling anything else to the British. Widespread official corruption. And then a political unrest. We talked about the Taiping Rebellion against the Qing, killing 20 million people. So you might want to stop the video here this is the part you need to get from the notes. This is the left side, and the China, the new imperialism this is on the right, and then the China and the new imperialism on the left. So China is finally, as a result of these wars, remember the long and short of it is they're forced to open their trade. Okay, so they accept these terrible treaties, Treaty of Nanjing, and so on. And the foreign powers divide them up into these spheres of influence. And you see, this is a pretty good map of the spheres of influence, probably better than the one I showed you before, with the spheres of influence of the different countries. So that's actually a pretty good map of it, to show you how this lays out. So then you've got the Chinese people rising up against opium and foreigners, and as these spheres of influence are in there, the Boxer Rebellion was only ended when the U.S. Marines had to march into Beijing to rescue besieged foreigners. Again, the Chinese rose up against against opium, and remember they were forced to sell the opium, forced to make the opium as a result of losing the Opium War. So the Chinese people have had enough of foreigners, had enough of the Qing, so they rise up again after 50 years after this Taiping Rebellion and try to remember the Society of Harmonious Fists and try to rise up. And it's really put down. So they failed in the late 1800s. China tried to modernize. They failed at it, unlike the Japanese. So attempts were too weak, too late. The Chinese Republic is finally set up after a little while the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. An uprising of peasants, students, and local warlords ended the Chinese monarchy. So again, this is just a brief overview, a brief review, and I know I'm going through this quickly because we've done this before. The story of the Chinese and how they gave into imperial powers and lose their sense of nationalism. So finally, in 1911, the uprising of peasants works, and you had students and local warlords and the Qing dynasty, and a republic is created. And when we come back to China, we'll be coming back to China in the sense of who's going to take control, the nationalists or the up and coming communists after the Russian Revolution. So again, unlike the Japanese, they failed to modernize. So you can stop this here, or you might have gotten it down after I've talked. So in 1912, Sun Yat-sen starts what's called the Chinese Republic finally. Okay, so Japan, we've talked a lot about Japan already as well. Again, remember the isolation that they're in, and then we move to industrialization and imperialism. So isolation, industrialization, and then finally imperialism. Remember, that's the story with Japan. Isolation, industrialization, and imperialism. So in the 12th century, Japan has a feudal system, and it's ran by the emperors will allow this shogun or warrior chief to run Japan. I was telling you about this before. They were allowing a warrior chief to run Japan, and the Tokugawa shoguns isolate Japan from the world. It's feudalism up till 1600, when everybody else has moved past that. There, when the U.S. Commodore Perry forces the shogun to open Japan to foreign trade, they realize, oh my goodness, we're 250 years behind, like I told you. So they have this Emperor Muchoshito, otherwise known as Meiji, take over power, and he ushers in the modernization. The Treaty of Kanagawa forces Japan U.S. Commodore to open up trade to the West. This should be your right and left hand side notes on your screen, so you might want to stop it now if you need to do that. So again, the emperor overthrows the shogun rulers. There's several different battles that take place, and then the emperor decided to copy the Westerners. He industrializes Japan and builds a powerful army. So the Meiji period has a lot of Western influence: modern military, modern Western buildings, Western infrastructure. Remember that quote from the education that I gave you on the last test, when we talked about extensively, that a lot of you unfortunately got wrong, where they were debating about whether or not they're going to keep traditional Japanese values or Westernize with their education, and it was going to end up being a combination of both. So modernization in the Meiji era, the last shogun resigns. Japanese is ruled by Emperor Mushihito, otherwise known as the Meiji. Japanese copies the West and industrializes, builds an army. It's a story thus far. So you've got the Meiji, you've got popular art of the Meiji era. This painting shows a soldier dreaming of him being at home. Popular art. A lot of paintings and so on. So, and then we already talked about this. The Russo-Japanese War showed the world that Japan was serious. This is the point where they know, the rest of the world knows that, remember, they took over Korea as a protectorate, Port Arthur and stuff. They know that they're going to be a strong power. So Japanese attacks China in 1894 and then war with Russia in 1905. They occupy Korea as a protectorate by 1905. So some of this is a little bit of review. That's why I'm kind of going fast. And at this point, you can stop it and get the notes left and right-hand side about the Meiji Restoration. Okay. Nothing to get here because I'm going to leave this to being very anti-world because this is about economic imperialism in Latin America. But it's important to understand that we've already talked about Bolivar. We've already talked about um, the fact that the French defeated Spain, and this created a thirst, so to speak, or a inspiration for people to rise up against Spanish colonial masters. And I should have shown this map before. I always forget about it. Is this is Bolivar's this is Bolivar's holdings, Bolivia, Peru, and this is what he fails to unify in terms of being able to, in Venezuela, he fails to unify these, and he's not happy about that, and neither are some people else. So it did not bring in freedom to a majority of people in Latin America, unfortunately. Rich people, usually the Creoles, kept most of the land and power, as we've talked about. And then we've got Diaz. Okay, so what about Diaz? I'm going to talk a little bit about Diaz here. Remember, you don't need to get this. So Diaz was the guy who really looked for really drove Mexican independence and the idea of manifest destiny, which you've talked about. So let's move a little bit over to what now would be. So you've got that, and then you've got Japan modernizing, and then let's talk a little bit about the law reformer very briefly. We're going to come back to Mexico a little bit more later on when we start talking about reforms. But remember that Mexico when we last left Mexico, they had wanted to declare independence, but now they've fought a war for independence, and led by Santa Anna. And this is when Mexico fights back against the annexation of Texas. Santa Anna is defeated, but so this is, remember the background of this: the Mexico versus Texas. I'm not going to take notes on this because you probably did this. I'm hoping you did this a little bit in your U.S. history, your 8th grade U.S. history, and this just reviewing. Mexico wanted Americans to move to Texas, so there was a war over. Mexican controlled Texas, and Santa Anna eventually loses that, and the U.S. finally annexes Texas. But this is before Santa Anna becomes a military leader and dictator. But after he loses Texas, this new guy, and this is where you need to start getting notes, emerges a new leader in Mexico, Benito Juarez, opposite of Santa Anna. He's not a dictator. He does things for the wealth of the welfare of the country, and he becomes governor of a Mexican region in 1847, and starts a reform method we call Spanish La Reforma, stripping the military of its power, ending special privileges of the church. That part in red right here, that part in red is the part that you need to get. That part in red is the part you need to get right there. Looking for my markers, but I can't find them anywhere. So this part that I'm circling in red is the part you need to get. You can stop at any point to do that. Santa Anna does eventually send him into exile. He's not completely free of Santa Anna's rule. He tries to start a reform movement. When released, he went back to helping Mexico with his problems. Eventually, the French are going to invade Mexico, and Maximilian is going to come in and take over as emperor, and we will talk about that a little later on. But right now, know that there's push for reform under the La Reforma movement of Benito Juarez. Moving on to a little bit of self-rule in Canada, just briefly, and this is again talking about nationalist, imperialist movements, imperialist resistance, nationalism. That's why these two units are kind of tied together. This new imperialism, and then you've got Canada. So Canada ends up quickly in the story in Canada. You've got, of course, conflicts stirring between the French and the British. And there's over time the British and many more English-speaking colonies populated Canada after the French found them, and Britain takes control of Canada after the result of the French and Indian War in 1763. So therefore, you've got separation. Basically, there was conflict between the remaining French, and these newly speaking English-speaking colonists. So both groups were pushing Britain for a greater voice in governing their own affairs. The Remedy tried to remedy this problem through separation, equal division into two halves: an upper Canada for the English and a lower Canada for the French. Each province elected its own official assembly. What is this at work? What's at work here? Nationalism, right? Nationalism at work here. So the separation had seemingly worked. Each individual group were content amongst themselves, but by the early 1800s, the colonies began demanding political and economic reforms that and then the French flat out refused to remain under British rule. So there began to be rebellions in the 1830s. And they sent a statesman to inspect it, Lord Durham, and he urged them to unite Upper and Lower Canada as a province. So it was widely believed at this point that Canada badly needed a central government, didn't have one. So they created, and this is what you need to get down, what's in the yellow here, an Act of Union, 1840, joining the two Canadas together and gave them a legislature and control of the domestic policies. Britain kept control of foreign policy and trade, and this is where Quebec starts to come into play. And then by 1867, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick joined the province for the Dominion, effectively making Canada self-governing in domestic affairs, but then remaining part of the British Empire. So this is how they end up compromising between what the French wanted and still the British maintaining control, but the French keep their autonomy specifically in Quebec. So again, that's the Act of Union, joining the two Canadas together. They give them a legislature and control of domestic policies, and Britain keeps control of foreign policy and trade. So this gives you a little overview. Some of it's a review, some of it was new, of nationalism, imperialism, new imperialism in these areas. And it should finish off the notes for either slide 30 and 31 or 29 and 30, depending on your grade. 29 and 30 for the sophomores, 30 and 31 for the freshmen. Okay, see you next time. Spoon out.